Today, DSMA is our featured supplier guest. And to get things going now on today's topic, understanding automotive buy-sell best practices and fundamentals, is Doug Austin. Take it away, Doug.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. We've got quite a crowd today, and we're happy to have you all. The buy-sell space is certainly picking up and pretty active right now, as we all know. So this is just a perfect topic. We're happy to have Andy Church deliver this session yet again today. We started this program, as you all know, as a spend management company. We started this webinar program almost 2 years ago now. And our objective is really to bring creative ideas and some of the best suppliers in the space to address expense categories, audit and recovery categories, new revenue opportunities, as well as topical sessions like today on buy sell. We really hope you enjoy this. At the end, we're going to have an opportunity to we'll talk about the availability of this webinar for all of your purposes and access to that information. But for today, we're excited to have Andy again and have him share some of this important information with all of us. So take it away, Andy.
Hey, good afternoon, Doug. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Doug. I appreciate you allowing us to do this again. Really enjoyed last time. And I think based on the feedback that I received from a lot of people, there was a lot of good questions and a lot of good content. So what I've tried to do here is share some new things, also share some of the best practices that we discussed in the past, and then also update some of the information. So the interesting part about the mergers and acquisitions, the buy-sell business, is it does tend to trend up or down and change. So I've updated some of that information as well. Happy to share that today with your team. We're going to talk about a few different concepts, some of the basics of a transaction and what we mean in some of the terms that we use throughout a transaction. We're going to talk about real estate and how it affects. Then we're going to talk about some of the important stuff, which are the pitfalls to avoid and the best practices in order to make sure that you have a successful and smooth transaction on your own as well. We're also going to talk about the best practices that you should utilize if you're buying a dealership or if you're thinking about selling your dealership. And then a little bit into what's happening, a little bit of a crystal ball into what's happening in the industry right now and what we're seeing moving forward with the challenges and opportunities from a dealer perspective. So there I am. So Dealer Solutions, Mergers and Acquisitions. We are a mergers and acquisitions firm in North America. We operate in both the U.S. and the Canadian markets. Mergers and acquisitions is our foundation. Commercial real estate obviously becomes a piece of that. A component of the transaction always is the land and building and those opportunities. And we've had a third bow to our ring now where data information management is also important. So what does it look like? What do the financial analysis and the averages look like in that? So you're beginning to see data-driven transactions and that intelligence become more available through the process as well. A little bit about our organization. Proud to say I just got back from Cancun. We had a great corporate meeting, our yearly corporate meetings. 51 members now of our team. Very proud. Farida Med and Max Theoret are our founders and owners of the company. 51 members in the team now, growing substantially over the last few years. Really proud that there's 8 ex-dealers on our team. Many of those we did the transaction for, and they decided to join our team afterwards, which is awesome. We've got people from the banking background, CPAs, lawyers. We've also got some OEM factory people as well as marketing teams. So very robust team to help us make sure the transactions go smooth and well. Enough about us. Coverage-wise, as I mentioned, we do handle the U.S. and Canada. So we got multiple markets and locations throughout. So we've got representation wherever it needs to be done. Some of the things, just a quick little snapshot of our business. We've done over 1,500 valuations and over 400 transactions. Great thing is we're selling about dealership about every 4 days at this point. So it's a very robust marketplace and continuing to go on. So let's really get into the meat of what we're talking about. We're going to start with a couple of terms, whether you call it goodwill or blue sky. You've heard those terms probably. That's the value of the business itself and what that looks like. In order to understand that and how that looks, we have to do what we call profit normalization. And what that means is looking at your financial statement is one way to look at it. It means money, right? How much is the dealership worth? How much is the business worth? Real estate obviously being a secondary item, inventories and things like that being secondary items that can be a little easier to ascertain those value. The goodwill, the blue sky, that's the one that takes the most creativity and intelligence to really understand what that is. So just to talk a little bit about that, our foundation, our in-house CPA team has done multiple valuations, as you can see here, trending around 200 to 300 over the last few years. And looks like the market continues to be robust. We did 288 unique valuations last year in 2022. So still a lot of interest in this marketplace and a lot of opportunities out there. So I got a poll question. What is the biggest impact on how desirable a dealership is? In your opinion, do you think it's the profitability of the dealership, the brand that it has, the location, or possibly the facility? So vote now. All right, I'm seeing the votes come in now. A lot of interesting so far. I think everybody can see this, but I'll read them off as we're getting there. We're almost up to 100%. So far, brand is leading the way at 50% of the votes. So 50% feel that brand is the most important factor. 25% feel profitability is the most important factor. 21% say location, and only 4% say facility. So interesting there. And I think you know what? All of A, B, and C are correct answers. It's what that balance is. Interesting to me to see that 50% really feel brand is that strong. Profitability usually comes in a little bit higher, and obviously location, depending on whether or not it's a metro store or not a metro store. Those three items can have a big impact on what the value is of a dealership for sure. So interesting information there. Let's continue on. Okay, so let's look at the key items to review. If you're thinking about having a transaction, or when we look at transactions, we look at a few different key items. We look at the adjusting entries. In other words, what are the year-end entries? What are the P13 statement? What kind of opportunities are there? What kind of things are being added back? That other income, that is always something that gets talked about and examined. In other words, do you possibly have a reinsurance company? Do you have doc fees and other things that actually have an implication on the business, or possibly on the potential seller, right? Or the potential buyer. So if you bought that dealership, would you understand, and do you understand the implications of the reinsurance company and whether or not you need to start your own? How does that impact the customers? Was there a tires for life program? Things like that throughout the transaction that you want to understand. And are manufacturers payment sustainable? In other words, that facility question could come up. Are you eligible for facility already? Are there improvements that have to be made in order to become eligible? And a lot of programs are tiered programs. So do you understand what those programs are and how you want to participate in those programs? And then the third thing we look at is the normalization. And this really looks at the management compensation structure. In other words, are you paying your staff accordingly? Do you have a general manager? Are you the general manager? And if so, are you paying what the market rate is on that particular position inside of the dealership? Real estate always becomes an important factor. Most often, we still see today that real estate is owned in a different company, maybe a holding co, maybe something like that. So quite often, we see the real estate transact at appraisal rates. So what does the market say it's worth today? But if you're still using a rent factor based on an appraisal you had done 5 or 10 years ago, or when you purchased the business, that may in fact impact your profitability. So you may be showing a higher profitability than the buyer can anticipate based on the mortgage and the appraisal that they're going to have to take out as part of the transaction. Non-reoccurring expenses, easiest way to give an example of that would be the COVID money, the PVP money that came out. that's considered a non-recurring expense or a non-recurring income. So you have to take into account those types of things and understand the impact they have on the bottom line. And then extraordinary items, maybe things like a hailstorm that happened and you had an insurance claim that paid out, or potentially a lawsuit where you had to do a settlement, something like that. We're trying to get to the point of what would this store look like had somebody else been running it or looking at it, to understand what is the true business doing that. So the business items versus the outside or extraordinary items. Hopefully that makes sense. Those are the key items that you want to look at and start to organize as you're thinking about a transaction. When we look at normalization, this is typically when we want to look at the last 4-year statements. I know for a lot of people, if you were talking a year ago, they were looking at a 2-year or a 3-year average. I would say most buyers today want to see a 4, sometimes even 5-year financial statements to be able to do their analysis completely. And whenever possible, if you can get and provide accountant reviewed statements, those are audited statements, that's a fantastic thing to have as well. Sometimes that's not available. Sometimes it's a more difficult task to get. So we have to use the dealership, the OEM financial statements, but you want to make sure that you're able to provide those. Composite reports are always a great thing to have if you're buying a store or selling a store, especially if you're buying a store, being able to look at what other dealers or the average is in a particular region or marketplace. That's important factors to know as you want to go forward and be able to see what you could possibly do with the asset as it goes forward. And then, of course, market share. For a similar reason, right? We want to be able to look at a market share report and understand what other dealers are doing in that market of the same brand. And then almost sometimes more importantly as well, what other brands are doing in that marketplace. So they're underperforming or overperforming other brands or competition in that marketplace. That's all what we're talking about is you're trying to turn information into intelligence. These are 4 great sources of information that we can use to help us make intelligent, better informed business decisions. When we're looking at the real estate, there's some particular considerations that you want to ask yourself. If you're on the selling side or if you're considering selling, do you want to lease that? Do you want to sell that property? If you're on the buying side, is it a demand? We are seeing a trend towards more and more buyers wanting to own the real estate. But that being said, there are alternative vehicles out there as well from a financing perspective that allow you to complete a transaction in a different way. For example, there's businesses like Legacy Automotive Capital that will actually come in and purchase the property and do a lease back to the new operator. So there's different ways of looking at that real estate. You want to decide what's right for you and what's best for you. But those are key considerations. What's the cash flow impact? What's the capital impact? How much is the down payment? The other things you want to know about real estate, and this happens during the appraisal process, is does it have to have a phase 1 environmental, for example? That's an environmental assessment on the property to make sure that it's clean. And then is there anything that needs to be fixed in that regard? So those are all conversations that happen around that real estate part of the transaction. There's pros and cons to each of that situation. Education is the most important thing when it comes to understanding that. And I think getting those cards on the table early, understanding from your buyer profile, do you want to loan, is owning the property a deal breaker for you? Or if you're a seller, is selling the property a deal breaker for you? So there's opportunities and areas that you can actually, if you are looking for today, for example, if you're a seller and you're wondering, what do I do with that capital now that I've sold the real estate? There are many different vehicles out there to allow you to put that into another investment and still enjoy similar tax savings and similar advantages from an investment portfolio as well. Same thing on the buyer side. There's advantages sometimes to not owning the real estate and allowing you to keep that capital in the business and use it for operations. So you just want to make sure you spend some time thinking about that and talking it through with one of your team of professionals to understand the best decision for you. Quantitative, right? When we look at profitability, we're always looking, and I mentioned the data intelligence earlier. We call that quotas, our quota system. That gives us data and intelligence. we look at that and we compare opportunities. We compare different valuations and different goodwill and different sizes by volume and things like that. Being able to do that and look at trends and weighted averages, again, that's partially why you want those financial statements so that you can actually produce your own type of information and thoughts. When I talk about weighted average, I'm talking about, there's a lot of conversation now about the last 2 years in profitability being very, very strong. So we look at how do you weight the prior years before COVID, the COVID years, and now coming out of that into the future years. How do you give those individual years weighting and understanding of what the business is going to look like going forward? Now, nobody has a crystal ball, but by using some of that data and intelligence, we can create a weighted average that addresses some of those types of things. So you want to be able to think that through. On the qualitative side, I asked that question earlier in the poll question, market and location being very, very important on that list, right? What's the market? Is it a growth market? Is it a top 25 city in America market? Is it a declining market? So there's many different factors into what's happening in that. One of the examples I give I'm in Georgia today, traveling around the state, but one of the big impacts in a lot of cities in Georgia is Hyundai announced they're building a plant. That's a large plant that's going to create a lot of jobs. It's in a fairly rural area right now, but you can expect that the dealers in that area and also, other businesses in that area will see growth of population. So is it on the uprise, right? Things like that. Are the management and key employees willing to stay on? Do they want to stay on? If buyer looking into that, human capital is one of the most difficult things to find right now. And so you want to know, is it a strong management team that's there, or do I need to replace some people in order to bring my own people in? And we see that quite often, whether or not. So human capital can be a very important and valuable asset, obviously, throughout any transaction. Is the facility, we talked about that earlier, is the facility imaged, or does it require an upgrade? That quite often happens during a buy-sell transaction where the OEM may make that a requirement for approval of the new buyer. Some type of facility improvement or investment, brand separation, possibly if you're talking about a multiple brand facility, things like that. This one's an interesting one, asset or share structure. North America wide, we typically see most of our transactions, probably over 90% in the US, are asset purchase, or we're starting a new entity completely and closing the old entity. So the old business is going away. The new business starts from day one, different name, different business. Sometimes, though, we do see share purchase assets, which means they're coming in and not buying all the assets of the business. They're actually buying the shares of the business. And that allows someone to exit that or everyone to exit that. So there's a couple of different ways, but you want to be able to talk to your team of professionals, your lawyers, and your accountants about what are the advantages and disadvantages of each of those types of transactions. As I mentioned, most often in the US, asset transactions are what we see. Quite often in Canada, we'll see almost a split between a share purchase and an asset purchase. So different ways to look at it. Next one is, what's the facility conversation? What's the condition of the facility as it sits today? Nobody wants to necessarily walk into a store that has 20 lifts and only 10 of them actually work. So are the furniture, the fixtures, are they in good working order? Is the equipment operational? Things like that. Always something that if you're a buyer, you want to look at. And if you're a seller, obviously those things go to show people that you're willing to keep up your investment and look at it. This one's a really, really important one. It takes a long time sometimes to turn around a reputation, right? So the reputation of the dealership. So do your research, look at, bbb.org, the Better Business Bureau. You want to look at the Google reviews, Dealer Rater reviews. There's so many different facilities and ways out there to look at that information. Very important to understand what the reputation is and what work needs to be done, if any, to improve that reputation or to keep it going as it goes. And then, as we mentioned earlier with the real estate, this isn't something you have to know on day one. You can enter into the progress and the process of a transaction as you discuss the purchase or lease of a facility. Often we see even almost a hybrid of the two, where it may be a lease with an option to buy at the end of a time period. Maybe that's 3 years or 5 years. That gives us some kind of continuity of transition. So those are different things that you want to think about and understand what works best for your particular situation. Key performance indicators. This is something you really want to look at in the operation, right? That's the profitability. So we talked about brand, we talked about location, we talked about facility. Now we're talking about what's the operation itself? What's the profitability? You can break these down by looking at the key performance indicators, understanding the retails and the grosses to go with them. F&I, is there upside potential in the finance and the business office? Same thing in service and parts. Strong absorption ratio. Are the labor rates good and strong for that area? How are those departments performing? And then ultimately in the industry, we use return on sales obviously as a guide for that. And so you want to be able to look at what is the return on sales. But when we look at return on sales, we quite often look at it after that normalization. So after we've added and deduct any additions or deductions from income, so we understand the true picture of what the business looks like. Whole goal here obviously is to identify the upside opportunities and also identify the downside or the risks so that you understand, again, turn that data, that information into intelligence so you can make the best business decision for you, for your business, and for your family, obviously. Let's talk about some trends. 376 transactions in the US last year. This is according to Automotive News. This is all buy sells, 568 rooftops. So still a large amount. There's about 16,000 rooftops in the US and about, I want to say 4,000 in Canada. So you can see the percentage of transactions there, still robust, but still a lot of transactions still happening. Looking at some trends, about 80% of the transactions that we deal with are sold on a multiple of that net profit, a multiple of that normalized EBIT. And about 20% are sold by what I mentioned earlier, that quotas value, which is basically, let's say the store's not profitable or the store's underperforming. It doesn't make sense to apply a multiple because the market and the brand are very, very strong, but that profitability side is a little bit weaker. So sometimes we have to go with, okay, what is the brand? If you were starting brand new, what would it be worth and what would the investment be that in order to get that facility and that business up and running in the marketplace? So that's what we call a quotas value index. On average, last year, we saw the average goodwill of a dealership at $5.4 million per transaction. Most common reason, this is my poll too. Most common reasons for selling a dealership. What do you think the most common reasons for selling a dealership are? Retirement, pressure from the manufacturer, realignment, especially with a dealer group, realignment being a brand or territory, and then of course profit takers. So these would be, in the housing industry, you might call them a house flipper, right? They come in, they buy a business, they know there's a lot of upside potential or they improve the business, and now they've decided to sell the business. So we look at it from that regard. So we give you a few more seconds here to vote. We're up to around 62%. Looks like so far retirement is winning the race with OEM pressure coming in tied for third and fourth with realignment, and profit takers at 22%. So interesting results there. Let me talk about what we see. So that OEM pressure, we see that, not really that high of a percentage, less than 5%. Retirement kind of leads the way with realignment. So realignment comes in around 51% in our experience. Retirement coming in at 41%. And then profit takers coming in around 10%. So you see those different criteria. So both criteria at the top there, retirement and realignment, speak to different changes within the business itself. So someone wants to leave the business completely, or a group has decided that a particular brand or section no longer fits their profile of what they want to do. So that's kind of what we've seen there. All right, so let's talk about sales cycle. So interesting information there on the see where everybody's head's at. Let's talk about sales cycle. Historically, 10.7 months, about 11 months from the day we signed an agreement with someone till the day that transaction closed. Did slow down during COVID, I think expectedly, right? 3 months we were all on pause kind of thing. So about 13 months on average. In 2022, we saw that backlog start to go down and OEMs react faster as well. A lot of OEMs still at the beginning of last year and maybe even still today are working remote. That certainly has slowed down the process of some of the approvals and getting all the information in and correct and things like that. Our fastest sale that we've ever seen, 3.4 months, and our longest sale, unfortunately, around 2.5 years. Now that was multiple buyers where deals had not come to fruition. So that's the longest one we've ever seen. So you can see there, but on average, that 10 months, we're seeing that, and I think we're going to continue to see that come down over the next few months as the backlog and carryover continues to get filtered through and people are more adapt to working remotely through the process. Let's talk some multiples. Now, this is a little bit of an eye chart, so I broke it down into a little deeper view, if you will. So I split the two multiples here between the US and Canada for anybody who happens to be here on a Canadian call. We do see multiples typically are slightly higher in Canada versus the US. We can talk about that on another webinar and why we think that happens and whatnot, but we certainly see a little bit of a difference there. This is the luxury range here. You know, Porsche tends to be at the top of that list from desirability. Most buyers we talk to, when you say, what would you like? They say, man, I'd love a Mercedes or a Porsche. Love one, you know. So we do still hear those are high desirable. Why? A, very profitable brands. B, they're not very large networks. The networks aren't oversaturated in markets. So availability of inventory is still a good thing for the dealers in those particular markets as well. BMW and Audi obviously on there as well. And I think everybody understands JLR, you know, even with the news just a couple of months ago, Jag announced they may be changing the way they do business, right? And the way they brand. That causes some uncertainty within the dealer network. And obviously that leads to being a less desirable franchise from an acquisition standpoint. So we certainly see those things have important impacts in the marketplace. Let's look at a little more of the domestic and some of the other ones. See Subaru up there, Toyota up there. You know, Volvo has been improved very much so over the last 18 months. Volvo continues to increase their multiple that we see them coming in at. Honda remains strong. Acura is up in there. And then as you go down that list, you can see, you know, Nissan's got some improvement to do. I think they're on the upswing from some of the desirability that we've seen and heard, but still some opportunities to continue the growth in that area as well. Some additional, so now the domestics, you know, the Ford, it's pretty stable over the last year, maybe seen a little bit of a decrease from a buyer's standpoint because of some of the uncertainty talks with EV and what they're doing with some of that type of business. I think they corrected themselves in the fourth quarter of last year with some of their conversations with dealers and modifications to the EV programs that they've been making. So hopefully they'll continue to consider the dealer's opinion as that moves forward. And, you know, there's a lot of weight there. We are dealer advocates first and foremost. So the franchise system is very important to DSMA and to myself. So that's something we constantly watch is, okay, who's investing in that opinion, right? GM there, we certainly have seen a little bit of changes in the GM place. For example, with the Buick program and some dealers, you know, being offered to buy that franchise back. That obviously decreases the overall franchise count, which in the long run could actually be an increase to the franchise value on the long term. Less outlets, less points means hopefully more inventory for those individual points and an increased sales potential. We'll see. And same thing with CDJR. Again, I think strong dealer relations there. They're, you know, interesting conversations that we're having and we're seeing, and obviously some facility conversations happening as well around Jeep and some of the other brands separation wise. But I think you hear some positive things coming out of that conversation. Let's talk about some goodwill trends. Over the last few years, you can see there in 2017, interest rates pushed down a little bit, but volume and profitability was very, very strong. We saw values continue to go up and up and up. COVID hit. Obviously, the world stopped for a while. And then we got kind of a COVID bump after that. What we're seeing in 2023 is there are pressures. Now, we're not seeing it all reflect yet, but we are seeing some pressures on profitability. So dealer profitability in the Q1 of this year, I think the news has stated it's down. I wouldn't say down substantially, but it's definitely down over last year. The inflation obviously is having a downward pressure on those types of trends. Interest rates going up, that's going to have a downward pressure on some of that. Retail volume, we put it there as a yellow because it's a brand by brand right now. Some brands, you can't get inventory at all still. They're still working through those supply chains and things like that. Other brands are actually seeing an increase in volume. For example, Hyundai fared very well through COVID because they had less of a supply chain issue. They owned their supply chain almost from front to back. That meant their value and their dealer profitability stayed stronger in a lot of ways through that whole process. So I think we'll see that probably continue as well. That being, and Hyundai being one of the brands that's very desirable right now as well. Future retail in the U.S. The question is, what's going to remain? Nobody's got a crystal ball. We'll talk a little bit about some of the issues that we're seeing, but supply chain issues, inventory shortages, will they continue? Electrification is still a conversation. And the interesting part of that conversation now is almost switching from, not an if, but a when. We all know that the EVs are coming and that the push is coming and everybody's going to be in that game. I think from the dealer side of that challenge, we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, is how does that look? How does that look at an individual dealership? How do they execute on the strategy with the vehicles coming? So we'll talk about that just in a minute as well. Let's talk about some best practices if you're a buyer. So if you're a buyer looking to potentially purchase a dealership, what should you do? This is the balance sheet approach. So we want to do your due diligence. That's the big thing, right? You want to look at the receivables. You want to look at the business itself and understand, are these receivables collectible? Are they overaged? Are they real? Same thing with inventory. You want to look at the turnover of inventory. What's the parts inventory look like? Is there obsolescence in those parts? Has the dealer that you're purchasing from maintained that and written parts down, or they still own all the inventory at full pop, even though, they may be at a 30% obsolescence in that inventory, things like that. Same thing with the used vehicles. You want to look at that and understand how old, what's the aging of those vehicles? Is there potentially water in that inventory and value that you're going to have to take on as you go through as well? How does that look? Shareholder loans, intercompany receivables. Is this company tied to other owners or other businesses? And how do you untangle that? So you just want to understand all that. What are the accruals and the reserves that the dealer is currently doing or utilizing, and how do they put through those? And then is there any other debt in the business that maybe the business is responsible for that has an impact on you if you purchase the business as well? So you can have those kind of issues as well. Other items, you want to look at the employees. You want to understand the pay plans that they're currently under, and if that aligns with your thinking from a pay plan perspective. How many employees? Are they overstaffed or understaffed currently? How does that look? We talked about real estate earlier. I mentioned the environmental being one of those particular items. The two terms you hear there are phase one, which is to look to see if there could potentially be an issue. Not saying there is one, but could potentially be one. And then maybe you may see what they call an order for a phase two. And a phase two means we think there's a potential issue. We need to do further examination. So you need to understand, what's that look like in a transaction from a phase one to a phase two. And then if there's remediation, that's the third term. In other words, is there something that has to be done to correct an environmental issue? And ultimately, who pays for that? Is it the buyer or the seller? So those are the type of due diligence things you want to do so you understand what's happening. And then obviously you want to understand from the business standpoint, are there any claims? Are there any lawsuits against the business that could potentially impact or hang over that you may need insurance or protection from as well as you go forward? So really it's about trying to get that information so you can turn it into those intelligence items to make your best business decision. Evaluate the assets. This is kind of that tree, right? When we talk about evaluating the assets, we're talking about looking at the inventories, including the fixed assets, the other working capital items. Every dealer has to have a working capital requirement, and that's an amount of money in the business to operate. The OEM, they all have different calculations for that. So you want to understand what that looks like going forward and how much you'll need to invest. And then ultimately, what is the goodwill? What's the person asking for from a goodwill or blue sky perspective? And do the numbers justify that? Or are you willing to do that based on the potential? When it comes to inventories, you do want to look at new vehicles, used vehicles, and parts. New vehicles, obviously, the biggest thing there is what's the floor plan carrying expense and things like that. On the used vehicle, as I mentioned earlier, what's the age of the inventory? How much water is possibly under that? And is there a good solution going forward for how to get and acquire additional inventory in that particular market if it's a new market that you don't currently operate in? And then as we talked about with the parts side, are the parts up to date? Is obsolescence understood? Is there good tracking and measurements in that system in that particular parts department? All of those can have an impact on how you decide and how you believe you should proceed with the transaction. Key considerations here, you got to work with a detailed list. Work with a list of what you think you need in order to do that and make sure you get those items. Hire professionals, whether that's DSMA or an accounting firm to help you do due diligence, or a lawyer to help you do your agreements, your other agreements that need to be happen. But you need to be aware of everyone involved, right? And mindful of the timelines. Those are the two big things. You want to be aware of who all is involved in that so you understand each of their roles and what are the timelines to ensure that you can get a transaction done in a timely manner. Recommendations, like we talked about before, involve trusted partners. There are no silly questions. Ask all the questions. Don't sweat the small stuff. If we're talking about pennies on a dollar versus some of the large items, make sure that you get some of those bigger items done and don't get so lost in some of the tiny items that won't have a viable impact on your operation of the business 6 months or a year from now. Be involved. Be involved. Don't let somebody else just drive everything. Make sure that you're involved and have an opinion. And then obviously, as I mentioned before, seek professional advice. This is a large transaction. For many people, it's the largest transaction you'll do in your lifetime, whether you're the buyer or the seller. So you want to make sure you've got professionals involved to help you make the best decisions possible. My mom always said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I still try to live my life. I learn that lesson every time I go, oh, this will be easy. Then I learn it. Oh, I should have known. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you're thinking about selling, here's some best practices here as well. Boy, do your homework. Confidentiality, that's important, right? Confidentiality. We all work under confidential basis, and you want to make sure that you've got that confidentiality inside of your dealership and inside of all your trusted advisors to ensure that nothing gets out before you wanted to. That's why you got to involve experts. Trust the professionals. They understand how to do it. We use, for example, confidentiality agreements for all of our conversations, enforceable confidentiality agreements, because you want to make sure that stays remain. Your secrets stay your secrets as you want. Walk the dealership. Just like you recondition a car, make sure you walk your dealership. If you're thinking about selling it, make sure you walk your dealership and it looks good. You're going to walk people through there that are prospective buyers, and they're going to want to see that you cared for the asset the way you should. Make sure you read your dealer agreement, know your rights. For example, does your manufacturer have the right of first refusal? In other words, can they stop a transaction in the middle stream and bring in a different buyer or someone else to replace the person that you've been working with, whatever it may be? So you want to understand, could they require a facility upgrade or not? State laws are different in each state. So that's back to the professionals. And if you need a lawyer to help you with a transaction, things like that, that's definitely an asset you want to have. Somebody who's done transactions in the automotive space. Hire professionals and allow them to work with you to execute on your wishes. Employees, do you have a plan? Right? Do you care? Oftentimes, most often we see an agreement that they'll hire all or most of the employees at a like salary. So you want to make sure you're taking care of the people that have helped you build your business and do that. This is an interesting one. I always ask people, what would you do after you sell? Do you think about it? Have you thought about it? Do you know what that looks like? The more time you spend kind of thinking about that and understanding what the exit is, you can get professional advice there as well. What are you going to do with the income? This is the large transaction. What do you plan on doing with those assets? Transferring them into a different investment strategy, retiring completely, having other businesses that you want to operate. Those types of things are important to look at it. And then as I mentioned a few times before, the real estate and what options do you want on the table? Are you willing to lease it? Are you willing to sell it? How does that look? If this is the same as the buyers, it's on purpose because it's the same. You got to work with a detailed list. You got to hire professionals who know what they're doing. You got to be mindful of the timelines, and you really have to be aware of everyone involved so that you understand how you can help steer that and make it make the most sense for you. This is your most, a very valuable asset for you and for your family. It's a great opportunity to create generational wealth. So make sure you treat it with the seriousness that you should. No silly questions. Ask them all. Involve trusted partners wherever you can. Use a common sense approach. Don't try to get too stuck on individual things. Again, be involved, seek professional advice, and don't sweat the small stuff. It's going to be a lot of up and downs in a transaction. The more the trusted officials and the trusted professionals can assist you in evening those out, the better off you'll be. All right, so there's some best practice from the buyer, from the seller's perspective. Let's look into the future a little bit. What are we seeing? So EV is what everybody wants to talk about in the future. So I ask you a question. In 2022, what percentage of new vehicles were EV in the U.S.? What percentage of sales were EV in the U.S.? Seeing the votes coming in, just give you a couple more seconds here. We're up to 62% of the vote, over 70 now. All right, so let's see where we're ending up here. I'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, so we've got 21% voted 1.3%. 21% voted 2.6%. 39 voted 3.1%. And 18% voted 5.6%. So the answer is 5.6% is the answer. 5.6% of all sales, new vehicle sales that is, in the U.S. were EV vehicles in 2022. So still nascent, really, when you look at it from a percentage. So still very, very small piece, but very much on the mind share, probably at 80 to 90% of all dealers. Why? Because as you look at things and the challenges for the next few years, electrification has been used to float this idea of an agency model. So you need to understand the brand that you're either buying or selling. What are they looking to do? Are they looking for an agency model? This is where you would be a dealer, but rather than determining the gross profit, you would sell at a set price. You would receive a set commission for delivering that vehicle. So that's got to be top of mind. That's got to be a conversation is this brand going that way? And how much do I know? That electrification conversation comes up as well, obviously, especially as it rolls out over the next few years. Some brands have announced, they're going to be more and more EV towards 2030. Some are saying we're going to be alternative fuels as well, including EV, but all of the above approach. So you want to kind of know what that is. And then you got to determine your own opinion on what that looks like, right? To finish up on electrification, the other question is, you can make big investments in your dealership, and it may be part of a requirement if you're purchasing a store that you put in so many charges or do this or purchase that or purchase this. At the same point in time, you need to understand also that that's not the only implication in the dealer world, right? Many of you probably have already talked to your power company, and the power company is saying, you can buy the charger tomorrow. I can't get you a transformer that can supply the power, or I can do this, or I can do that. So you want to make sure that you're mindful of that process and you're mindful of the impact that it's going to have. This is a challenge that dealers are going to face for sure. 100%. What's that look like? Supply chain. Some brands are still affected more than others, but I'd say that overall, we're still seeing a lot of supply chain questions, whether that be down to individual components or entire model lines. So we're still seeing that. Obviously, the economy and interest rates is at everyone's mind. There was a lot of hints just a few weeks ago that the Fed was not going to increase interest rates. They ended up doing it one more time, a quarter point. Now the conversation is, will they do it again, or do they feel, what's happening? As we go forward, next year starts another election year. Election years are always uncertain times and things like that. So that can cause additional uncertainty as well. And then obviously succession planning is always a challenge. So do you have one? And we almost call it now progression plan, right? Where do you want to progress to? Do you want to be in the business? Do you want to be an owner? Do you want to hand it down to your family, or possibly sell it, or possibly bring in a partner, whatever that may be? Those are conversations that you need to be thinking through and having, because they're challenges that you will face over the next few years. All right, my last poll here, poll number 4. What do you think is the biggest challenge that dealers are going to face over the next 5 years? Is it the agency model? Is it a supply chain? Is it the economy, electrification, succession planning? What is that? And I think the interesting point to bring the model here too is we feel if there's very low inventory still right now out in the marketplace, so we still see a lot of buyers and some sellers sitting on the fence. Maybe that's partially because of this, uncertainty of which one of these items is going to affect them most, and they're not really sure how to deal. But this is a great opportunity and a great time to get a valuation on your business and begin to consider what does the challenge and what does the future look like for you. So let me end the poll, and I'll share the results here. It looks like from a shared results standpoint, 32% said agency model is the biggest challenge facing dealers over the next 5 years. Coming in a close second, electrification at 28%. Coming in behind that, the economy. Then now supply chain. If we'd done this poll, I think we did this poll a year ago, supply chain was one of the top ones. So we are seeing some normalization there. And believe it or not, succession planning only came in at 4% of the vote. So interesting that that's not the biggest challenge. That electrification and agency model looks like it is going to be. So in your opinion. So that's fantastic. Appreciate the feedback. And each dealer will have a different situation and opinion. All right, so let's talk the future of retailing. No matter what, change is going to happen, right? Change is coming. Dealers are still going to be at the center of automotive retailing. What I will say is I'm very encouraged. Spent a lot of time going around to different events and talking to dealers, talking to attorneys. States are getting stronger with their franchise laws, which is fantastic. Lawyers are understanding that more and more. Dealers are getting more vocal about it as well. So I would say dealers will continue to be the center of automotive retailing going forward for the foreseeable future. And we're here to help ensure that future is strong, robust, and profitable. So Doug, I think I'll turn back to you with some questions. Here's my contact information if everybody wants to reach out to me directly. But if you have any questions, I would say now is the time to put them in the Q&A section, and I'm happy to continue to answer any questions at all.
Sounds good, Andy. Again, click on the Q&A button. That's for all content inquiries. So we have a few minutes remaining to answer as many as we can. Well, let's begin with this one. Should I get a property appraisal before bringing my dealership to market?
It's a great question. I think you'd ask yourself this. If you've not had an appraisal done in a number of years, then more than likely you should get an appraisal on your property, because sometimes, I have a friend who used to always say, do you think or do you know? And that's the answer, right? So you might think it's worth this, but knowing what it's worth, going into that and being able to plan that going forward is a great opportunity to do it. It's not a must-have. If you had an appraisal done last year, for example, for some whatever reason, refinancing or whatever it is, then you could probably not need to get another valuation or another appraisal, because we can probably do a pretty good estimate of what it's going to look like. And ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, in the transaction, the buyer is most likely going to have an appraisal done by their finance source is going to require it. So if you've had one done in the last 18 to 24 months, you consider, you know what, I could probably get away with not getting another one done immediately. But if it's older than that, you're probably best off getting one done.
Again, feel free to click on the Q&A button to enter your question for Andy. Here is another. How does DSMA see EVs affecting valuations in the future?
Another great question. I think twofold. I talked about EV a little bit already, but to expand upon that, I think that, dealers have to look at what's the long-term future with that brand and what's EV. So in other words, is it going to be all EV in the next 10 years? At which point that means that you're only selling one type of vehicle, or is it going to be some ICE vehicles, some hybrid vehicles, some EV vehicles, which may allow you to have a more robust product structure from a long-term perspective? And I think the third thing that you need to look at is what's the investment requirement? How much do you have to, not only from a dollar perspective, but from an operational perspective and a facility perspective, right? So can you get the electricity in from the street? Do you already have that in place? Maybe you're a newer building and you already thought those things through, or is it going to require you significant infrastructure cost in order to get the actual electricity to your dealership, and also maybe even require you, there's been some manufacturers who've been talking about it's got to be accessible 24/7. So what does that mean for your lot? How do you lock your lot? How do you not lock your lot? Things like that. So all those types of questions, I think you need to sit down and brainstorm about when it comes to EV, regardless of a transaction, really. You just need to understand where you think, and then get vocal with your state associations and understanding their opinions and what they think is going to happen.
We have time for one more question. Just wanted to remind people to please stay on till the end of the session for a post-session survey. We really want to get your feedback for the time spent. But here goes another question. What is the number one tip you would give a dealer to improve profitability?
I get this question all the time, and I love this question because as a guy who's worked in profitability for most of my career, and I think it's adjusted for me over the last couple of years. For me, it starts with communication. So my number one profit tip that I always give is have a manager's meeting. More importantly, make sure you're communicating with that management team. What are the goals? What are the strategies? I mentioned just earlier that, we just had our corporate retreat, and that's what we do. We go away and talk about what are our goals? What are the strategies to achieve those? And then we communicate that, and we keep communicating it. So those weekly managers meetings, when you can communicate what's happening in the business, what do we need to achieve? How do we continue to achieve it? How do we drive it forward? Communication and having that management meeting is going to drive your profitability every time. What we pay attention to increases. So when you're paying attention to communication, you're paying attention to profitability, they will increase.
Doug, feel free to bring your webcam up again. I'm going to start the post-session survey just to get people's replies here before they depart. We appreciate everyone's time on that. Go ahead, Doug.
Well, that was a great last question on improving dealership profitability. That's the whole business that we're in. And I couldn't agree more. I think, Andy, you're right that the group has to set an objective, and not only an objective, but set an aggressive objective, because there is, in our experience, we know that a dealership is going to spend 5% of sales, or $100 million group will spend $5 million on supplies and services, and out of that $5 million, about 25% is available in new profitability, or about $1.25 million. So there are opportunities to get that, but you have to set aggressive objectives and put a team in place that, to Andy's point, is meeting regularly and communicating and measuring performance and feeding that back. And when you hit those milestones, you celebrate results too, because it's a big deal. You can't sell your way into profitability in a challenging environment. We all know that. So you have to manage that bottom line too. Andy, this was, as usual, a very informative discussion today. I found myself taking pictures of your screen a lot for ideas for, to communicate content of our own. So thank you very much. I appreciate the time that you invested in this and your willingness to join us here today. I would just say that if any of you folks in attendance today are interested in looking at your profitability and expense control, reach out to us. You can contact us at Chris Austin at strategicsource.com, C. Austin at strategicsource.com, and we'd be happy to chat with you, give you a quick demo. Our phone number is 612-386-3898. Be happy to provide any information that would be of interest to you on the expense control side. With respect to this webinar, David will have this webinar probably posted and available to us to hang on our website, probably no later than tomorrow. And if you're interested in getting a copy of this, you can certainly reach out to Andy directly or reach out to us, and we'd be happy to provide it. But in the meantime, thank you all for attending today. It's been a great session, well attended, and we hope that you find increased value in this session and the information provided. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Doug, and thanks everyone for attending, and good participation too on that post-session survey. That's great. So thanks everyone for your time today, and we look forward to you joining us on future webinars with Strategic Source. Have a great rest of the week, everyone.